Welcome to this lecture on women's development and empowerment, uh, of course, in the context of India. From the 1970s onwards, India entered a new chapter in women's history. The focus shifted from viewing women as passive recipients of welfare to recognizing them as active agents of development. The earlier decades had laid the foundation of equality through law, but now the challenge was to ensure participation, employment, and decision making power. The feminist movements of the 1970s questioned state policies that treated women as dependents rather than as citizens. The term empowerment replaced welfare, emphasizing self reliance and control over resources. However, if we go chronologically, then the first 2 decades mark the recognition or acknowledgement of women only as units of welfare till 70s, and by the late 70s the Indian state started focusing on development rather than welfare, and uh, late 70s till early 90s we can define this period as the period of development approach of the state. So while first 2 decades were the welfare approach of the state vis-a-vis women, the decade from late 70s till early 90s can be called as the decade of development, when the Indian state is viewing women as not merely the units of welfare, but somebody who deserves development. And 90s onwards is the phase of empowerment approach. So we see that this is how we moved from welfare to development to empowerment, emphasizing self reliance and control over resources. The 1975 to 85 United Nations Women Decade influenced India's policies, making gender equality a development goal. By the 1990s, empowerment became part of economic planning and governance. Women's movements, education, technology, and global influence all contributed to this transformation. Now, this lecture explores how women's journey evolved from the first national policy for equality to their leadership in every sphere by 2023, marking one of the most significant social revolutions in modern Indian history. The decade of 1970s marked the beginning of global recognition of women's rights as integral to human development. In India, despite constitutional guarantees, inequality persisted in health, education, and employment. The United Nations declared 1975 as the International Women's Year, leading to a worldwide push for gender equality. The Indian government established the Committee on the Status of Women from 1971 to 74 to evaluate women's progress since independence. Its report was discouraging. Entitled Towards Equality, it exposed alarming gaps in education, political representation, and workforce participation. The findings shattered the illusion that legal rights alone ensured equality. The 1970s thus became a decade of self awareness and collective mobilization. Women's organizations, student groups, and rural collectives began demanding accountability from the state. This decade created the intellectual and political foundation for future empowerment policies, shifting India's approach from charity to justice. The Towards Equality report was a milestone in the history of Indian feminism. It provided statistical and sociological evidence of gender bias in all areas of life. It revealed that women were less than 20% of the formal workforce, had significantly lower literacy rates, and almost no presence in policy making. The report argued that development programs ignored women's contributions to the economy, especially in agriculture and informal work. that engages more than 90% of working women. It called for gender sensitive planning, special education drives, and leadership training. It also criticized the patriarchal structure of family and law that limited women's autonomy. Importantly, the report redefined women's issues from social welfare to development and equality. It gave the women's movement intellectual legitimacy and prompted the government to design specific programs for women. This report remains the foundation for modern gender policy in India. The decade of 1980s is very important, a turning point. It transformed feminist ideas into institutional structures. The sixth five-year plan from 1980 to 85 was the first to include a chapter on women and development, and that marks the change in the approach of a state towards women. Now, women is no more a unit of welfare. Rather, state is thinking and talking about the development of women. It emphasized income generation, education, and health rather than just welfare. Women's development cells were set up in ministries and universities to coordinate gender programs. The National Perspective Plan for Women from 1988 to 2000 laid long term strategies for equality, including political participation and employment. Government and NGOs began collaborating to promote literacy, vocational training, and self help groups. The shift from welfare to development recognized women as contributors to the economy and decision makers. Yet, the period also revealed bureaucratic challenges while policies expanded, implementation remained uneven. Nevertheless, the 1980s established the principle that women's progress must be integrated into every sector of national planning. The decade of 1970s and 1980s saw the rise of independent women's movements across India. Urban feminists protested dowry deaths, rape cases, and workplace discrimination. Campaigns like the Mathura rape case of 1972 mobilized nationwide outrage, leading to amendments in criminal law. Rural women organized movements like Chipko and in Uttarakhand and Seva in Gujarat, connecting environmental and economic justice. These movements were not just about women's rights, but also about redefining justice, labor, and citizenship. It also emphasized the need to revisit the legal protections available to women. Feminists argued that patriarchy operated in both family and state institutions. For the first time, media began covering women's protests seriously. The feminist awakening made the government more accountable and transformed women from silent victims to vocal activists. The political power of these movements would shape future laws and social norms in India. Responding to social pressure, the government introduced major legal reforms to protect women's rights. The Dowry Prohibition Act was strengthened through amendments in 1984 and 1986, and Section 498A was added to the Indian Penal Code to criminalize cruelty by husbands. The already existing Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961 was revised. The definition of dowry was expanded. The Equal Remuneration Act of 1976 ensured equal pay for equal work, at least on papers. Later, the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005 expanded legal definition of abuse and also the perpetrators. While earlier laws pertaining to domestic violence covered only the physical abuse and that too by the husband and the in laws only, the new act redefined domestic violence as much more than physical abuse. It included more mental abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, etc., etc. And the list of perpetrators also included now the parents, brothers, both the natal family and the nuptial family, and even the live in partners and the boyfriends. These laws represented a shift from moral persuasion to enforceable justice. However, enforcement remained inconsistent, especially in rural areas. Legal literacy programs were introduced to make women aware of their rights. Over time, these reforms built a stronger judicial framework for gender equality, marking a transition from tokenism to tangible empowerment within the Indian legal system. The Mathura tribal rape case drew the attention of the country towards an anti rape law that was drafted way back during the British period. Obviously, a law drafted during the British period can never give any kind of protection to the victim, but all the loopholes to give a safe escape to the accused, who are obviously either the British officials or the elite class, the rich landlords or the zamindars. It had such discriminatory provisions like a passive resistance means tacit approval by the victim. No injuries or no resistance, no strong resistance from the victim means tacit approval of to the or the tacit consent to the sexual intercourse. It included features like the past history and character of a woman are going to work as evidence while dealing with the rape law. For the first time, we revised the antique rape law made during the British period in 1982 after lots of resistance and civil society movements, and that was reflection of the growing consciousness towards rights of women. Education became the cornerstone of empowerment. Between 71 and 2011, female literacy rose from under 30% to over 65%. The government introduced programs like Mahila Samakhya in 1988 to promote collective learning and confidence amongst rural population. The National Policy on Education of 1986 emphasized removing gender bias in textbooks and curriculum. Midday meal and Sarva Siksha Abhiyan schemes improved girls' school attendance. Women entered universities, professional courses, and public service in greater numbers, though it was not very huge, but definitely a positive step. Education transformed not only employment but also family attitudes. Literate mothers ensured better health and schooling for children, multiplying the effects of empowerment. Also, literate and economically independent women contributed to the economy of the household, making them the assets of the family. Education thus evolved from a welfare measure into a tool of a social change, creating awareness, independence, and leadership amongst women across India. Well, economic independence became central to women's empowerment after the decade of 1980s. Rural women joined self-employment groups, cooperatives, and cottage industries. NABARD supported self-help groups, SHGs, giving access to microcredit and entrepreneurship. Urban women entered sectors like banking, education, healthcare, and technology. The 1990s economic liberalization expanded job opportunities but also created new challenges like wage gaps and job insecurity. Manrega 2005 guaranteed rural employment with one-third reservation for women. Women began contributing significantly to GDP growth, especially through informal labor. Digital initiatives in 2010s or in this particular decade, such as Mahila Heart and Startup India, further expanded entrepreneurship. By the 2020s, women's work was recognized not as supplementary but as vital to India's development and sustainability. Well, political empowerment became a defining achievement of the decade of 1990s. As mentioned earlier, we can divide the approach of a state towards women or the journey of women's rights into three different phases. The first two decades marked welfare approach, where the women was viewed only as a unit of welfare. 70s onwards, the state was talking about development of women, and 90s, the decade of 90s marked the beginning of the empowerment approach. The 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments reserved one third of seats for women in Panchayat Raj institutions and urban local bodies. This revolutionized rural governance. Over 1 million women entered local politics, handling budgets, schools, and healthcare. Training programs were introduced to build leadership capacity. Women's visibility in governance normalized female authority in public decision making. Many local leaders like Chavi Rajwat and Bhavri Devi proved that grassroots governance could be transformed through women's participation. This experience also created a political base for the later Women's Reservation Bill at the national level, yet to be passed. Political empowerment redefined democracy by linking representation with social transformation. Of course, there was lots of criticism as women were more a stooge in the hands of the male counterparts, and they aren't actually exercising the political power or the decision making power. It is their male counterparts who are actually making use of this political power given to women through reservation. True, they were called pradhan patis, true, but over the last few years, women have come out of veil and come out of isolation, and they have realized the significance of or the potential of this power given to them through reservation, and now they are asserting political power, uh, keeping their male counterparts on the side. Well, health and nutrition initiatives. Health and nutrition became central themes of empowerment after 1980. Maternal mortality and malnutrition were key challenges. Programs like the Integrated Child Development Services provided food, health, and education to mothers and children. The National Rural Health Mission of 2005 and Janani Suraksha Yojana promoted safe childbirth and maternal care. Later, Poshan Abhiyan of 2018 aimed to end malnutrition through technology based monitoring. Women health workers, ASHA, and Anganwadi became change agents in villages. Reproductive rights gained a policy recognition through family planning and awareness programs. Health reforms emphasized that empowerment was incomplete without physical well being. Thus, healthcare moved from charity to a right, ensuring that women's health became a national priority. Violence and gender justice. Women's movements made gender violence a public issue. The 1983 Criminal Law Amendment recognized custodial rape and expanded legal protection. The 2012, as said earlier, before I take up Nirbhaya case, as mentioned earlier, that it was the decade of 1980s that can be called as the decade of pro-women legislation, wherein people were on roads against anti-rape law of British period, after Mathura tribal rape case that highlighted the deficiencies of the rape law and how anti-women it was. And so we amended the rape law almost more than a period of 100 or 150 years, and we quickly amended the Dowry Act of 1961 in 1984, and then very quickly in 1986, making it more stringent. And thus, the decade of 1980s can be called as the decade of pro-women legislation. That also highlighted the growing awareness and consciousness amongst common men regarding women issues and the weaknesses of the legal system. The 2012 Nirbhaya case triggered nationwide protest and led to the 2013 criminal law amendment, which strengthened punishment for sexual assault and harassment. The Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act 2013 made a safe employment a legal obligation, though it was quite a delayed process, as in 1988, after famous Vishakha case, Supreme Court issued stringent guidelines in the absence of a law or an act to protect women against sexual harassment at workplace. But these Supreme Court guidelines continued till 2013, when finally an act was passed after a long gap. But nevertheless, it was a big step. Helplines, fast track courts, and gender cells were established. Despite these measures, reporting remained a challenge due to stigma and fear. However, awareness and activism grew rapidly, creating a zero tolerance attitude towards violence against women. But it has not led to any kind of decline in the graph or any kind of discouragement on the part of the potential criminals. The period from 1980 to 2020 marks a moral awakening in India, or awakening of the common man, where violence against women was recognized not as a private tragedy but as a violation of fundamental right. Every act of violence or crime against women leads to huge pan-Indian resentment, as it happened in case of Nirbhaya or in case of the doctor in Calcutta. However, much needs to be done. Women in media. The media became both a mirror and a platform for women's empowerment. Newspapers, television, and cinema started portraying women as independent thinkers rather than victims. Female journalists and filmmakers began highlighting gender injustice. Campaigns like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao used media to change mindsets about the girl child. The internet and social media amplified women's voices. Movements like Me Too and digital feminism emerged globally and in India. Rural women gained digital literacy through programs like Digital Saksharta Abhiyan. The media's transformation democratized gender discourse, bringing issues like consent, identity, and representation into the public domain. Women no longer remained subjects of stories. They became storytellers, shaping a national conversation. A technology became a new tool for empowerment in the 21st century for everyone. Mobile connectivity and internet access brought financial and educational opportunities to millions of women. Digital India initiatives promoted online entrepreneurship and e commerce for women artisans. Platforms like Mahila Heart and PMEGP supported rural businesswomen. Online learning expanded access to higher education. At the same time, challenges such as cyber harassment required legal responses, leading to new IT laws and cybercrime units. Digital spaces helped women bypass traditional barriers of caste and geography. By 2023, digital inclusion had become a cornerstone of India's gender strategy. turning technology into a bridge between empowerment and equality. Let us see the role of women in leadership and governance. From the 1980s onwards, women began occupying higher position in governance. 1980s was also, or as I said, that the decade of 1980s is a decade of pro-women legislation. That is also the time, just 2 years before 1980s, that it was in 1978, CB Muthamma challenged Civil Services Recruitment and Promotion Act of 1951 that was very, very discriminatory for women IFS officers, wherein women IFS officers were supposed to, you know, uh, they were supposed to seek government permission before they get married, and if they get married, they can be sacked anytime on the grounds of efficiency by their senior. However, nowhere it was defined what efficiency exactly means, but no such provision for male IFS officers. As a result of this, a number of female IFS officers either preferred to remain unmarried or they resigned once they get married. This was challenged by C.B. Muthamma in 1978 and was finally scrapped. Similarly, it was in 1985-86 that Nagesh Mirza challenged the Discriminatory Air Hostesses Services Act, and thereby it was scrapped. So the decade of 1970s and 80s is very, very remarkable. Now, this is also an important decade for leadership and governance. Indira Gandhi's long tenure as Prime Minister broke gender barriers in leadership. Later, we could see the first women president, Pratibha Patil, and Draupadi Murmu now, the first tribal women president of India. Women judges, diplomats, and defense officers gained prominence. Corporate leaders like Indira Nui and Nirmala Sitharaman, Sushma Swaraj demonstrated women's excellence in economics and policies. For the first time, we could see women as the external affairs ministers, or as defense ministers, or as finance ministers. The increase in women's leadership positions showed that empowerment was not limited to basic rights but extended to decision making. Their success symbolized a much more mature democracy that recognized competence over gender. Global engagements and international forums, India's participation in global gender conferences strengthened its domestic reform agenda. The country played an active role in United Nations World Conferences on Women in Mexico in 1975, Copenhagen 1980, Nairobi 1985, and Beijing 1995. True, these World Women Conferences did not change the status of women overnight, or I would say they have not been very significant in making any drastic changes in the status of women. But they are like sign marks. They played a very important role in sensitizing the world community and creating consciousness towards women's issues. India ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, in 1993, aligning national laws with global norms. Indian NGOs and scholars contributed to international gender policy research. Global exposure helped Indian women leaders advocate for sustainable developments and climate justice. International collaboration reinforced that women's empowerment is both a national and global responsibility, connecting India's growth with universal human rights. The past decades witnessed a renewed focus on holistic empowerment. Schemes like Ujjwala Yojana provided clean cooking fuel, improving women's health and environment. Beti Bachao Beti Padhao targeted female infanticide and promoted girl child education. The campaign for constructing toilets. Of course, important for everyone, but particularly for women, as going out into the fields is not only a security threat, but toilets are also a symbol of hygiene along with security. One of the biggest reason for the girls dropouts in the schools is the absence of or the lack of toilet facilities in the schools. The Maternity Benefit Amendment Act of 2017 extended paid leave to 26 weeks. Digital missions such as PM Daksh and Mudra Yojana promoted women's entrepreneurship. Women entered combat roles in the armed forces and police. The National Education Policy 2020 emphasized gender inclusion. These reforms show that the state's shift towards integrating gender in every policy area, be it economy, education, or defense. Empowerment has thus evolved from a goal into a continuous process. Between the 1970s and 2023, Indian women's journey from welfare to empowerment became one of the most significant social transformations in the country's history. The focus moved from protection to participation, from dependence to leadership. Laws, education, and technology together created new spaces for equality. Yet, challenges like wage gaps, violence, and security underrepresentation persist. The most important amongst them is the violence against women, the lack of security for women. Empowerment now means the ability to make choices, the freedom of choice, and shape destiny economically, politically, and socially. The transformation of Indian women symbolizes the maturity of Indian democracy. The journey continues as empowerment evolves into equality, inclusion, and dignity for all. The history of Indian women thus mirrors the nation's progress from survival to strength, from silence to leadership. Thank you.